Hello and welcome to MEE Live. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Thursday, the 12th of August, 2026. Today, why is Latin America saving Israel from diplomatic isolation? We deep dive into Venezuela in the wake of Trump's abduction of its president as it restores ties with Israel after 17 years of condemnation. Later on in the show, our special correspondent is back from Lebanon and he has some tales to tell about Hezbollah, its turn towards guerrilla combat, and whether disarmament is on the cards. All that after the headlines. It's been revealed that the US killed and wounded hundreds of civilians in its airstrikes on Yemen last year. 153 killed, 243 wounded. The Pentagon disclosed the numbers to Congress, including one single attack on Hodeidah that killed 80 civilians in what Human Rights Watch has said should be investigated as a war crime. US President Donald Trump ordered the American military to begin bombing the Houthis in March 2025. The attacks came in response to Houthi strikes on Red Sea vessels, which the group said were made in solidarity with Gaza. Despite enduring over 1,000 US strikes, the group has since resumed these attacks in allegiance with Iran. The UK is set to announce a raft of restrictive new policies on Israel, MEE has exclusively revealed. In a telling early move as the new Foreign Secretary, Ed Miliband is set to ban goods from illegal settlements in September, alongside other regulations still under discussion that may extend to F-35 parts manufactured in the UK. It signals a shift in approach to British foreign policy since Andy Burnham became Prime Minister, and comes as several British charities are under investigation for allegedly sending money to illegal settlements. And Colombia has sided with Morocco over the Western Sahara. Its newly elected far-right government made the stark announcement as the country struggles with the wreckage of Monday's earthquake. Over 180 people were killed and thousands of homes damaged and destroyed by the magnitude 7.4 quake. The new president declared a state of emergency. The new administration then also endorsed Israel's annexation of Syria's Golan Heights. It echoes a shift in alignment across several Latin American states towards Washington, and with it, Israel. And that brings us onto our main story today. Tonight, a diplomatic shift that would have seemed impossible barely a year ago. Israel and Venezuela have restored full diplomatic relations, ending 17 years of severed ties. The two countries broke off relations in 2009 when the late Hugo Chavez expelled Israel's ambassador over the war in Gaza. For years afterwards, Venezuela was one of Israel's fiercest critics in the Americas and a close ally of Iran and the Palestinians. So what changed? Well, in January, US forces seized Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, in a military raid and flew him to New York to face trial. US President Donald Trump declared the United States would run Venezuela. The US framed all of this as freeing Venezuelans from a narco-dictatorship. Yet the new leadership, Maduro's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, has no fresh democratic mandate, nor given any timeline for an upcoming election. Meanwhile, Venezuela's oil, the largest reserves on the planet, is being opened up to American companies. Worth noting, one of the biggest financial winners from the US takeover of Venezuela is Paul Singer's Elliott Management, an APAC donor positioned to profit from a fire sale of Venezuelan oil assets. So the Israel story and the oil story may not be entirely separate. Under Trump and a compliant new government, Venezuela has swung sharply towards both Washington and Israel. And it is not alone. Across Latin America, a wave of new right-wing governments is rushing to embrace Israel, even as its warfare in Gaza and the West Bank continues. This week, neighboring Colombia recognized Israeli control over the occupied Golan Heights. Honduras has also restored its ambassador. Israeli officials are calling 2026 the year of Latin America. To help us understand what's driving this and update us on what's happened to Venezuela since US intervention, I'm joined now by social scientist and journalist Joseph Bouchard. Joseph, welcome to MEE Live. So Venezuela spent nearly 2 decades as one of Israel's fiercest critics in the region. How significant is this that this has happened? How significant is it that this has flipped and that it has flipped so fast?
It's quite significant. As you mentioned, Venezuela used to be actually the most important ally of Iran and the Palestinians for decades under Hugo Chavez and Maduro, and then has since flipped its position entirely, did a 180 according to Israel's government on Israel, where it now not only recognizes its diplomatic relationship with Israel, but also welcomed the Mossad directly into the Miraflores Palace a couple weeks ago. And Israel was leading the humanitarian rescue mission after twin earthquakes struck Caracas. And you've seen really this reversal where also, even though Venezuela under Delcy Rodriguez has continued technically its diplomatic relationship with both the Palestinian Authority and Iran, and even had meetings to this effect recently, they've really not kept its position. It used to be, for example, under Chavez, that Venezuela was supportive of Iran developing a nuclear weapon and defensive posturing, when it was even using reportedly sort of Iran's plans or strategy or know-how to build its own nuclear program. And now we're expecting, under this US-backed puppet regime, that Venezuela take more distance from Iran and Palestine and work a lot more closely with Israel, probably expected to buy Israeli surveillance technology, for example, Israeli weaponry, collaborate with Mossad on intelligence, and perhaps use it to locate Iranian intelligence agents and proxy agents and try to go after them. For example, there were plots by Milei's governments against Iranian and proxy agents recently. So I think this is quite significant, and we're seeing Venezuela go from the base of Iran and Palestine and their proxies in South America to now one of Israel's main allies.
I mean, you mentioned there the earthquake, just for viewers. This was a humanitarian response that Israel participated in when Venezuela was hit by twin earthquakes in June. And they participated despite not having diplomatic relations at the time. They also broadcast their participation in social media, which triggered accusations that they were humanitarian whitewashing at a time while they were still, causing destruction and are still causing destruction in Palestine. You also mentioned there talks of weapons sales from Israel. So is this shift that we're seeing towards Israel, which is happening not just in Venezuela, but other states in Latin America, are you saying this is just a transactional shift, or is there an ideological shift that is going hand in hand with that?
Well, there are a few components to this. I'm glad you mentioned humanitarian whitewashing. I think it's interesting that, for example, in Colombia, where there was also a 7.4 magnitude earthquake, as you mentioned.
Yeah, just on Monday.
Israel once again, yes, that's right, has once again led the humanitarian rescue mission. It's one of the only countries, along with right-wing autocracies in the U.S., allowed by the Colombian far-right government to do any humanitarian aid and rescue missions. And it's embarked on this sort of mission to sort of turn the region away from Palestine and Iran, which it historically was, and a bastion for even the non-aligned movement and these kinds of pro-sovereignty movements and resistance movements, into now the majority of the governments of the region, which are right-wing governments at this point, backed by the U.S., recognize Israel, have diplomatic relationships with Israel, And I'm glad you mentioned weaponry and technology. I think this is an important angle. Now, by Israeli surveillance technology like Pegasus, the ousted Colombian left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, alleged that an Israeli cyber intelligence company was behind the rigging of the election in favor of the pro-Israel candidate by deploying 500,000 disinformation bots. And there is credible evidence to point this out. And you saw weeks before the election, social media flooded with disinformation about, for example, how Abelardo La Espriella, who's the new president, was supposedly going to implement universal health care, even though he's for privatization, these kinds of programs. And you even see this in supposedly left-wing governments, like in Brazil, the military police continues to buy Israeli weapons. Israeli snipers, for example, are used much like it is in the West Bank and in Gaza to kill civilians in the favelas and marginalized areas. And now most of the governments in their wars on drugs, I'm expecting them to buy more Israeli weapons, more Israeli technology, surveillance equipment, and these kinds of things. And the end game, it is ideological. We see a high correlation with this sort of approach or policy with right-wing, sort of pro-evangelical, pro-US autocratic governments. But it is also about material interests. Israel wants governments that will buy its weapons, buy its technology, supply them intelligence, and take their intelligence to go after Iranian agents and their proxies, and ultimately wants to basically kick these adversaries out of the region, and make Latin America a pro-Israel region rather than either a non-Iran region or pro-Iran or pro-Palestine region, and use its presence in the region to go after these agents and their interests. For example, we saw, as I mentioned, Milei collaborating with Mossad and Israel intelligence to go after Iranian proxies. We saw the same thing against Hezbollah in Brazil. And so I'm expecting a lot more of this. And I think if you look at the way Israel and the United States right now talk about the region, we see that there's clearly a relationship with the rise of these right-wing governments and Israel's rising influence in the region.
And I think besides just the arms sales, the financial transactions, the intelligence sharing, this is coming against the backdrop of the genocide in Gaza, when Israel is becoming increasingly isolated on the world stage, including with some traditional allies. Is there a case to be made that Israel stands more to gain symbolically, diplomatically, from a run of new Latin American partners, even than it does from these financial transactional arrangements you're talking about?
Yes, you're right. It does make it seem like Israel is not isolated on the world stage, even though most Latin American citizens in most of these countries now recognize what has happened in Gaza as a genocide and do not support Israel. And there are lots of incidents in the last couple of years that indicate that there is a growing animosity against Israel. For example, you had wildfires started by Israeli IDF tourists last year that were blamed, including by the Milei government, on Israeli tourists. You had racist incidents of Israeli tourists, once again, who had served in the IDF in Brazil against black residents and these kinds of things popping around the region. And so this is clearly a way to shift the public attention and public support away from Palestine, even though, the disconnect between the state and the public could not be more clear. But I do want to raise how this materializes concretely. You even saw with the return of a pro-Israel government in Venezuela and Colombia, one of the first things they did was cut their material ties to Iran and Palestine, recognize in Colombia's case Israel's illegal case over the Golan, which belongs to Syria, according to the international community, or is at the very least disputed territory, which was then condemned by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and also kick or or rather withdraw from the ICC, from the Hague Group on Gaza, and take diplomatic steps to really support Israel's case in the international legal system. Colombia just withdrew its case, or rather its participation in South Africa's case against Israel in the ICJ. So I think it's important that both this represents, yes, sort of Israel trying to reverse its reputation around the world and its isolation around the world, but also this has concrete legal and diplomatic consequences. And I would like to mention also, there is a clear component to this with, Israel alleges that Iran and their proxies fund sort of cartel groups and illegal groups, criminal groups, including in tri-border areas, and uses this to fund their activities. And this is sort of, as we saw with the U.S. coup in Venezuela, this is the pretext. The war on drugs has been used repeatedly as a legal pretext for both the U.S. and Israel to further their influence in the region, to topple unfriendly governments and advance their own influence.
And you point to this disconnect between the populations and their governments when it comes to this question of Israel. How have populations responded to this change of direction by their government? And do you think it will dampen pro-Palestinian solidarity?
Well, not well. There is, as I mentioned, polling to suggest that the majority of the population in most of these countries, most prominently Brazil and Mexico, recognize this as a genocide, do not support Israel, and there's a real backlash in the voting population against this. And it might be that there is a minority support, say, for example, in the sort of right-wing evangelical base that's supporting, for example, Flavio Bolsonaro, the son of Jair Bolsonaro, former president, who's now jailed over his coup plot against Lula. But this is not a majority of the population. Majority of the population is either outright supportive of Palestine and Palestinian self-determination and the peace process, or at the very least against what Israel is doing. But Israel wants to use the state to forcefully change that dynamic and to try to impose itself on the region. But I think in the long run, what we'll see is a backlash, and we'll see a return to governments probably on the left, as it was during the pink tide, or as we're seeing with Lula and Sheinbaum, who radically now oppose Israel and support Palestinian self-determination, Palestinian liberation, have alliances with Iran, where in the past it might have been that they were willing to at least entertain a diplomatic relationship with Israel. But now, because of Israel's direct hand in coups, in rigging elections, in targeting dissidents, in using Latin America as an arena to go against its regional enemies and to support autocrats that are beneficial to its regime and use it to sell weapons and all these things that are then used to commit genocide and other crimes. I think these governments that were previously amenable to Israel will now say, well, we don't want to do this anymore. This is bad for our sovereignty, this is bad for our interests, this is bad for the region. Let's reverse course.
Now, if we turn to Trump's governance of Venezuela, over the last 7 months, Trump says that he runs Venezuela since the abduction of Maduro. Now, the US justified this seizure in part as acting in the interests of the Venezuelan people. Have ordinary Venezuelans' lives been materially impacted by this change, for better or worse?
Definitely for worse. We're seeing the United States take the oil reserves of Venezuela, which are the largest in the world, and put them in bank accounts controlled by Trump and by Trump officials. We even saw the energy secretary visit recently, where he took home tons of gold. This is the kind of policy that the United States, even though it's used narco-terrorism, election rigging, and these kinds of sort of quote unquote reasonable claims to topple Maduro and install pro-American regimes. This is really just about natural resources, controlling this important strategic territory, making the region into a pro-American bulwark. Venezuela for years had opposed a lot of American foreign policy in the region. Marco Rubio, for example, has this mission where he wants to turn every socialist government, whether that's Venezuela, Nicaragua, or Cuba, into pro-American governments through democratic or anti-democratic means, as we're seeing here. And I think Israel is not is involved in this directly, where we actually 1 week after the coup operation in January, the then Vice President and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Delcy Rodriguez, who's now president, said that there was involvement by the Israelis, that this is, as she said, an Israeli plot, and this is meant to support Israel's interests in the region. And now, cumulatively, it seems like she's proven herself right by restoring ties with Israel, welcoming Mossad into the palace, likely signing new deals with Israel, restoring the free trade agreement with Israel, and these kinds of things. So I think it's clear what the U.S. and Israel are after here, and it's definitely not democracy.
Joseph Bouchard, thank you so much for your time. And now we turn to Lebanon, reeling from the effects of Israel's months-long onslaught after Hezbollah joined the regional war with Iran. MEE asked senior Hezbollah official and politician Nawaf al-Moussawi, was it a mistake to get involved?
A lot of people who are not necessarily supporters of Hezbollah from all different parts of Lebanese society and Arab society and beyond could understand why the party entered into a conflict to distract or support Palestinians in face of a genocide in Gaza. But with the attack in March earlier this year, I think a lot of people that I've spoken to in Lebanon felt that it was a catastrophic decision by Hezbollah. Do you understand that?
لم تحصل السلطة اللبنانية على أي نتيجة مثل الانسحاب الذي هي تطالب به. لم تحصل حتى على انسحاب من قرية واحدة. على العكس من ذلك، يعني حين يجلس المفاوضون الإسرائيليون واللبنانيون في روما الآن، تقوم القوات الإسرائيلية بحرق المنازل وتدميرها في القرى المحتلة. ماذا يمكن أن يفهم اللبنانيون إذن؟ لا شك أن هناك يعني إعلام هائل ضد المقاومة، سواء يعني في فلسطين أو في لبنان، تحاول قلب الوقائع. فبدلا من أن يكون الاحتلال هو المشكلة، تريد هذه الحملة الإعلامية أن تقول المقاومة هي المشكلة. هنا يجب أن لا ننسى من هو المشكلة في الحقيقة. يعني مثلا لو قال في وقت من الأوقات قالت يعني الدعاية الإسرائيلية أن المشكلة هي فتح، الآن أصبحت المشكلة هي حماس. في المستقبل ستكون المشكلة هي أي تشكيل فلسطيني يريد العمل من أجل تحرير أرضه. فلذلك دائما المشكلة في الاحتلال وليس في التشكيل الذي يقاوم الاحتلال. يعني مثلا الآن يقولون حزب الله هو المشكلة. لنفترض أنه ليس هناك حزب الله، سيكون هناك تشكيل يعبر عن إرادة اللبنانيين في تحرير أرضهم، فسيصبح هو المشكلة حتى لو كان اسمه الحزب الديمقراطي الأمريكي. لذلك المشكلة ليست في فكر الحزب، يعني موجهة إسرائيلية، ليست المشكلة في فكر حزب الله ولا في طبيعة حزب الله. المشكلة هي أنه يريد مقاومة الاحتلال ويريد تحرير الأرض. كل من يريد هذا الأمر ستصوره الدعاية الإسرائيلية على أنه هو المشكلة.
Lebanon is living through one of the most volatile chapters in its multi-generational confrontation with Israel. Since March, a new war and a fragile, frequently broken ceasefire have left much of the south in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of people are still unable to go home. A US-brokered framework signed in Washington in June was meant to chart a path out of the war. Instead, it has divided the country. And at the centre of it all, Hezbollah. Written off as defeated barely a year ago, the group appears to have clawed its way back, and not for the first time. In late 2024, Israel assassinated its leadership and detonated thousands of booby-trapped pages and radios. Many declared the movement finished. Yet by March, it had joined the regional war, striking Israel in retaliation for the killing of Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei. Israel responded with a ground invasion and airstrikes reaching as far as Beirut. Yet still, Hezbollah fights on and is shaping events across the region. Our special correspondent, Daniel Hilton, has just returned from Lebanon, where his reporting revealed how Hezbollah survived, how gamers became its drone pilots, and how a frustrated Donald Trump demanded a direct line to the group and was denied. Daniel joins me now. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Having just returned from Lebanon, what were your observations on the ground? Could you see and feel the effects of the war?
So I lived in Lebanon for 5 years, which were the best years of my life. So it was great to be back. The last time I had been there was on my way back from Syria in December 2024, which was about 3 weeks after the that 15-month ceasefire came in. And the first kind of sort of Israeli war on Lebanon had paused. Back then, it was like I felt that the country was in a sort of worse place. It might have been because it was December, so everything's a bit more miserable in December than in the summer. So things seem to, like at first glance, to be a bit of a better place in Lebanon this time. But actually, I think once I looked a bit closer, I was there for a bit longer. I think that, it's just gone, like the country's gone through so much over the past few years. The economic crisis is so bad. And I think that everybody's just their nerves afraid. The, power situation is terrible. And nobody really thinks that the war with Israel is over. So everybody's kind of looking over their shoulders a bit.
Now, let's talk about Hezbollah, because in September 2024, just before you were last there, we were all but told Hezbollah was defeated. Its leadership and its headquarters had been pretty much eliminated. There were those pages attacks. How did Hezbollah rebuild from then?
Yeah, I think I thought it was on its knees, and I think quite a lot of people in Hezbollah thought that the game might be up as well. But I think they took stock of where they were, looked at what had been destroyed, what hadn't, and went into kind of survival mode. During that 15-month ceasefire period between the two wars, they were being struck almost daily by Israel. But they were still managing to reorganize the military wing. I think they looked back at a kind of guerrilla style combat that had been so effective against the Israelis in the first few decades of Hezbollah's existence, and tried to go back to that model because the military wing had become so overlarge. It had become a kind of conventional army in some ways that had worked okay in Syria. But in this kind of fast-moving situations within Lebanon, they found that it really, really wasn't effective, and they kind of just chopped it all up and gave it these kind of new guidelines. Each unit had a kind of playbook of scenarios so that it could operate on its own without any kind of central command, and that's made it a lot more flexible and able to kind of go into a kind of to work on a combat footing that is more familiar, I think, to the party. Politically, Hassan Nasrallah was killed, so was his deputy and presumed successor, Safi ad-Din, who were big heavyweights, and then Naim Assam, who was a kind of sort of familiar figure to many, like to many journalists. He was sort of people, you'd see him around on the ground at press conferences and that kind of thing, and he assumed power as the Secretary General. People have sort of been quite critical of him previously. He has none of the kind of charisma that Nasrallah certainly had. But he's sort of actually managed to steady the ship somewhat, restructuring Hezbollah on the political side, and, at a really, really difficult time. The whole time, he's been under threat of assassination as well from Israel. So I think that on the sort of political and the military side, there was a lot of restructuring that happened that they did in quite an effective way.
Now, before we go more into that sort of new Hezbollah, I want to pick up on something from your reporting, which was that around this time when everyone thought Hezbollah was defeated, one of your sources, an official who spoke on condition of anonymity, one of them said that the US and the state of Lebanon missed an opportunity to absorb Hezbollah.
Yeah.
When was this, and how did they let it slip by?
I think this was around the kind of turn of the year between 2024 and 2025, when, Hezbollah really seemed on its knees, and there were serious conversations, which are still going on, about disarmament, how Hezbollah could exist in any form, whether that would just be a political party, or whether it can still be an armed movement, and then I think that a lot of Hezbollah's enemies, including Gulf Arab states, Israel, Washington, its domestic enemies, sort of some of the parties that are its rivals domestically, really kind of sort of pushed very hard and thought, okay, we can trap Hezbollah, we can sort of force it into maximalist concessions. And that, in a way, sort of pushed it into a corner where it became more intransigent, where it was less likely to acquiesce to certain conditions and demands, because it felt that that everybody wanted it to be completely defeated, wiped off the map, and so that had a sort of the opposite effect, and sort of dug Hezbollah in to Lebanon politically and militarily, as well. That's the way that the sources put it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Where are the Lebanese people in all this? Because it's one thing for Hezbollah to reform militarily, redefine itself politically. Has it managed to build its popularity up? I mean, how much of Lebanon blame Hezbollah for the current difficulties from Israel, and how many of them have rallied around Hezbollah in the face of Israel's aggression?
Yeah, well, so first of all, Lebanon is an incredibly diverse place.
Tell me how the Lebanese
I would say that it's complicated. There are definitely opinion polls that show that many, if not most, Lebanese want complete disarmament of Hezbollah. There is other private polling that my colleague Adam Shamsuddin, who I worked with in Lebanon on this story, has been privy to, which was kind of backed by a Sunni Arab state, that showed that actually kind of popular opinion was sort of growing in favor of Hezbollah, and so that polling was never publicly released. Mm-hmm. I would say amongst Hezbollah's core Shia support base and membership, there were definitely questions being asked about the price that the community has had to pay to be associated with Hezbollah. I mean, Israel and Israeli officials, ministers, and and the military are using explicitly genocidal language about Lebanon's Shia, and is directly targeting the towns and villages which are majority Shia in the south, many of which have been completely wiped off the map. One source in the party described it as just kind of sort of 5 kilometers deep of football pitches, because there was no structures at all, a sort of like sort of Hackney Marsh transplanted into South Lebanon. But having said that, what are the alternatives for the community? Not a lot. Nobody's really offering them anything.
Right.
There's no real organized opposition, and I think the Shia feel under existential threat, so I think sort of some of the support is galvanizing around Hezbollah and Amal at the moment.
Now let's talk more about this sort of guerrilla-style combat tactics that you say Hezbollah is returning to. You paint a picture in which young gamers controlling cheap drones is sort of the new military stronghold of the group. How did that come to pass, and how effective is that against Israel's military?
Yeah, so first of all, gamers being kind of key in drone wars in the sort of 21st century is not novel. Like, we've seen it in Ukraine, where a lot of people who, played sort of shoot 'em ups were sort of adept at flying these drones and using them for combat. The kind of funny thing with these gamers in Lebanon was that I think a lot of more senior or older Hezbollah members would see these kids fighting these fictional wars cooked up by American programmers and think, God, like, what are the kids up to these days? And then it turned out that they were really good at fighting the enemy with this kind of new, drone warfare that everybody's kind of sort of doing in 2026. The drones themselves are operated using fiber optic cables. In the 2024 war with Israel, Hezbollah debuted a rocket that was sort of using some of the similar technology, but they seem to have repurposed a lot of that tech to plow into their drone program, which they've really stepped up. Using sort of 3D printing plus like all the kind of fiber optic cables. I can sort of imagine these reams of fiber optic cables that had just been sort of sitting around. They thought, okay, let's use it for drones, and they have been really effective against Israeli troops and tanks and APCs in South Lebanon. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu called them a central threat to Israel, and the tactic that Hezbollah is using now is quite different from what it was using before, which is that they're happy to relinquish territory to Israeli troops, but just make sure that they're never settled, that that they can never do what they did in 2024, which is fortify any of those positions to turn them into permanent bases, which Israel managed to do in 2024 in 5 points along the Lebanese-Israeli border, which kind of cements Israeli presence in South Lebanon. And it's anathema for Hezbollah to allow that to happen again.
How dependent is this version of Hezbollah on Tehran for its provisions, for its supplies? Because I imagine that's become pretty difficult right now.
Yeah. I mean, the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria has been, sort of devastating in terms of Hezbollah's supply lines. And also, there's been a lot more restricted aviation between Tehran and Beirut, and Hezbollah have sort of had to go it alone a bit. Financially, they've been under a lot of strain, and sort of militarily, I think there was a time in the 2024 war where all of these kind of senior commanders and leaders in Hezbollah had been killed. So had their deputies. So had some of those deputies as well. And Iran flew in their equivalents from the Revolutionary Guard, but they don't. Our sources in the party sort of suggested that they don't really need that Iranian oversight on the ground at the moment, because particularly militarily, the Lebanese fighters have fought a lot of conflicts recently. They're pretty adept, but on a kind of strategic level, I would say there's from what we heard a lot of coordination at the moment. People are sort of keen to stress that within that, Hezbollah has autonomy. So, for instance, Iran, we were told that Iran was sort of urging Hezbollah to respond to the repeated Israeli violations of the 15-month ceasefire before the Iran war kicked off. But Naim Assam and the rest of the party's leadership sort of felt, no, we're not ready yet, we're still rebuilding, we don't want to sort of provoke a war or sort of, escalate a situation that would be so badly, would reflect so badly on Lebanon. So, there is still autonomy, but whether the situation has changed with finances particularly, and I think we'll see how that plays out.
Okay, now in May, Donald Trump, US president, you know him, he asked Lebanon's ambassador in Washington for a direct line to Hezbollah. On the 1st of June, he then posted on Truth Social that he'd had a very good call with Hezbollah, and this had led to a pause in attacks. Did this happen?
So there are lots of conflicting accounts over this whole period. It kind of depends who you talk to, but what... So we got this, Adam Shamsa-Adin and I, from two sources in the party and one Lebanese official who sort of was, very, very close to things on the diplomatic side. And they all agreed that Trump rang up the ambassador and was like, get me Hezbollah. I want to speak to whoever. One Hezbollah source suggested that sent Lebanese officials into a flap, and they were just sort of calling around anybody they knew that might
they don't know how to reach Hezbollah.
Yeah, they were like, or they didn't quite know the right person to speak to, and so they were sort of calling sort of random sheikhs and like that kind of thing. It has to be said that the sources within the Lebanese state deny that version of events, and their version was that they denied, or that the ambassador said to Trump, "Look, this isn't wise. We'll find, we'd prefer that the channels of communication are through us or through, intermediaries, particularly because, not even the Lebanese presidency, which is leading the negotiations with Israel and Washington, has direct talks with Hezbollah's leadership at the moment. From the Lebanese state side, it was denied by the ambassador, and that was backed up by President Joseph Aoun. From the Hezbollah side, they said that they would not speak directly to America because it's it's one of their red lines. They wouldn't do that directly, as they do with they don't speak to Israel directly either.
Right. Now, I suppose whether or not Trump managed to get in touch with Hezbollah, he did mediate the framework that is currently in place between Lebanon and Israel. This was signed in Washington in June. It is supposed to chart the path out of the war, but you found deep divisions inside Lebanon, and Lebanon's own deputy prime minister told you that it may not be a binding agreement. What was your main takeaway from your interview with Tarek Mitri?
Yeah, I would say that the one interesting thing that he was sort of very keen to stress was that that it's in no place in the framework is it called an agreement or a deal.
I wasn't totally sure how to script it.
Yeah,
I went with framework.
The framework.
What does that mean?
So I think from what he was trying to sort of put across, it was a sort of starting point, and that in its current form, it's completely unable to pass through the Lebanese government vote, the Lebanese parliament. So far it's been negotiated only through the presidency and the embassy in Washington. And so, there are very few people in Lebanon and in the Lebanese authorities that have any ownership of it in its current form. One thing that a senior Hezbollah official, Nawaf Moussaoui, sort of was keen to stress to us was that the Lebanese state, and I use state rather than government because this is not like the sort of the cabinet that's been negotiating this. It's the presidency and the sort of the state has been going to these negotiations with Israel with really no leverage at all, and hence the kind of sort of terrible outcomes in this framework, which is so sort of weak and passive on the Lebanese side, and seems to sort of not secure a lot of really basic things like a withdrawal from South Lebanon by Israeli troops, or respect for Lebanese sovereignty, and has been roundly criticized even by some of the most fervent supporters of Prime Minister Nawaf Salam and President Joseph Aoun, perhaps not publicly so much, but behind closed doors, everybody was like, this is a bad deal.
Right.
Yeah.
And then final question, you've indicated that people you spoke to don't feel like the war is over. They don't feel secure in that reassurance. What about the prospects of internal conflict? There is mounting pressure on the Lebanese state to use the military to forcibly disarm Hezbollah. What is the likelihood of that triggering internal conflict?
Look, I think talk about any kind of civil war in Lebanon should not be cheap. In living memory for most people in the country, the sort of 15-year civil war that Lebanon suffered through. Having said that, there is genuine concern that Lebanon, might see clashes between the army and Hezbollah. Lots of people, Tarek Mitri was like, no, said that the Israelis might want to see that and might be kind of trying to sort of force that. And Nawaf Moussaoui said, it would be suicide for anybody to sort of raise arms against Hezbollah and the resistance, as he described it. But I think there is pressure, certainly from Israel, to some extent from Washington, and from some within Lebanon for the Lebanese military to take a more kind of sort of proactive, confrontational stance against the party, and that could be really, really dangerous.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to have you on.
Thank you very much.
And to all of you watching, thanks for tuning in. That's all that we have time for today. Like, subscribe, make sure you're following us on social media at Middle East Eye. You can email meelive@middleeasteye.net. I'll be here live at 5 every Tuesday and Thursday, noon if you're in New York. See you then.